Do you want your music to sound as it was recorded in the actual 80s? Well, here's my top list of things you can do to make that happen. For the love of all you hold dear, don't sidechain your bass to the kick. That pumping sound has nothing to do with the 80s. Roll off the bass below 80 Hz. Remember back in the 80s, all music were pressed on vinyl, and vinyl limitations made it so that bass could not be very loud and you had to roll it off so the stylus would not skip. So the 80s sound has very little bass, very little low end, so roll off a lot below 80 Hz. Another thing people seem to forget is that in the 80s, people wrote music, they wrote melodies and chord structures, they had their counterpoints, etc. And even if you didn't know music theory, like a lot of famous writers in the 80s never did, they had the instinct for melody and structure and chords and lyrics, and they were highly talented songwriters. So compose your music first with chords and structure, then record it. Another technique that's gone the way of the dodo today mostly is key modulation. You modulate between harmonic scales or key scales, not necessarily going from the verse to the chorus, but modulate inside a verse or chorus itself. Stockache and Waterman use that a lot for a lot of their hit singles, and Poison by Alice Cooper has no less than 4 different modulations within the first chorus. So this is a great way of getting a lift in the song that will sound very 80s. Don't over-compress or limit your final mix. This was of course something that happened in the 90s with that brick wall compression that is still going on. Forget everything about LUFS and stuff like that. In the 80s you had a much lower total output volume, and hold a little back on the EQ as well, not as much top end. Leave that to the equalizer on your hi-fi stereo when playing back your music. That's supposed to sound like it was done in the 80s. Record on tape. A lot of plugins emulating tape saturations, etc. Many of them are great, but nothing beats the tactile experience of recording directly onto tape with all the artifacts and goodness and vibes that can give you in terms of both creativity and sound. So record on tape if you have the possibility. Limit yourself to fewer tracks when you record and arrange your music. Maybe you had to go into a studio for a few hours, it cost money, you had to work fast, you had to work with limitations, you had to really narrow down your track number, and that limitation can really boost your creativity and get things done in much fewer tracks than you usually would do in a DAW. And in the 80s, that was very much the key. There's always room for more, but often less is more. If you're using MIDI sequencing, either in the DAW or on a vintage hardware sequencer today, don't quantize everything. Leave something unquantized to create that human feel to it all. In the 80s, even if they used MIDI, we often played the parts by hand, recorded it by hand, and we didn't quantize exactly to get that human feeling into it all. Otherwise, it will sound too sterile and actually not 80s. If you're going to have vocals in your music, then again, for the love of all you hold dear, don't even think about using Autotune.
The picture you see is no portrait of me.
Don't use Autotune or Melodyne or any automatic vocal tuning programs or software, etc. That was not done in the 80s. We did actually tune vocals in the 80s as well, but not automatically. It was all done manually, and I have links in the video description to videos where you can check that out. But don't use Autotune or Melodyne or something like that if you want to sound like it was done in the 80s. Use drum machines and not samples. In the 80s, where we used a lot of drum machines, those drum machines had their own internal swing. They had their own way of playing back those patterns that we programmed. And every drum machine has its own organic thing going, and that can be heard in subtle ways.
You waste your time like my money. It ain't so funny, but it's true.
When we started using samplers and placed samples within a sequenced grid, something disappeared in terms of that internal organic swing. So if you want to sound really authentic 80s, program all your drum patterns in a drum machine and record that drum machine, and you will see and hear that it's slightly different than just placing samples in a grid in a sequencer in your DAW. So definitely use drum machines to really dot the I and come out authentic 80s sounding. And since we're talking about drums, do your drum fills manually. In the 80s, it was not uncommon to do your hi-hat fills or your crashes manually recorded instead of having them played back from the sequencer or drum machine. Again, to add that human feel to it all. So definitely do a little bit of tom fills or whatever live manually on top of the other drum sounds coming from your sequencer or drum machine, again, for that 80s authentic feel. In the 80s, analog synths were not as much used as people seem to think. In the 80s, the race was all about digital and hybrid synths, with the DX7 coming in 1983. So during the 80s, samplers were really the thing to use in your music. You sampled your analog synths and layered them, maybe sampled them, recorded them back. This is the sound of the 80s. 70% digital hybrid synths, samplers, and maybe 30% were old good-fashioned analogs that were really on its way out back in the day. So have that in mind when you arrange and record your synths for an authentic 80s sounding production. Oh, and that gated reverb and long reverb tails? Well, that is a myth. Not all songs in the 80s had long reverb tails or gated reverbs on the drums. In fact, very few songs did. So hold back on that reverb tail and that gated reverb.
And you think you know what's going on. You keep telling me that I am wrong.
Well, these are my top tips for sounding as 80s authentic as possible. You might not want to go full on 80s, and therefore you can of course skip a lot of these tips. But these are tips I try to live by today, as I try to most of the time have my music sounding like it could have come out of the 80s. Other ideas, tips or tricks you'd like to share, please share them in the comment section. And as always, I'm Espen Kraft and I am the 80s. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!
The picture you see is no portrait.